I'm sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the lingering scent of packing tape and cold rink air. My name is Elena, and for 15 years, my life has been measured in rotations and edges. In figure skating, precision is a religion. If your center of gravity shifts by even a millimeter during a triple lutz, the ice doesn't just trip you, it punishes you. I've spent my youth learning to smile at judges while my knees bled under my tights. I thought this discipline made me untouchable. I thought I knew how to feel a crack in the surface before it became a hole. Mark entered my life 4 years ago when I was hitting a wall of burnout. He wasn't a skater, he was an architect, a man of solid ground. While I lived in a world of 4:30 a.m. alarms and the crushing pressure of qualifying scores, he was my grounding. He'd stand by the rink boards for hours, a silhouette in the dim arena lights, holding a thermos of cocoa that smelled like cinnamon and safety. He knew the exact tilt of my head when I was nervous, and he'd wrap me in a heavy wool blanket the second I stepped off the ice. I trusted him as implicitly as I trust the steel blades beneath my feet. I believed our relationship was the one place where I didn't have to fight for a perfect score just to stay upright. But over the last 6 months, the ice started to thin. It wasn't a sudden crash, it was a slow, quiet erosion of everything we had built. His phone, which used to be an open book, started living face down on every surface. His touch became technical, like a routine performed for the thousandth time, where the movements are correct, but the soul has evaporated. I blamed my exhaustion and his promotion. I was used to pushing through pain and ignoring the noise. I didn't realize that while I was spinning in circles, trying to be perfect for both of us, Mark had already stepped off the ice and into someone else's arms. The discovery wasn't a cinematic explosion, it was a hairline fracture I chose to ignore until the blade finally caught. It happened on a Tuesday, a day usually reserved for my most grueling technical drills. I had come home early, a rare treat, because the rink's cooling system had failed, turning my sanctuary into a slushy mess. I was exhausted, my muscles humming with that specific post-skate ache, wanting nothing more than to crawl into Mark's arms and disappear. When I walked into the apartment, the air felt different, heavy and stagnant. Mark was in the shower, the steam curling under the bathroom door. His phone was sitting on the kitchen island, buzzing incessantly. Usually, I'd ignore it, but the rhythm was frantic. I glanced down, expecting a work emergency. Instead, I saw a string of notifications from a name I didn't recognize, Sienna. "Are you still coming over? I missed you this morning. The bed feels empty without you." My heart did a terrifying freefall, the kind you feel when you lose your footing midair. My hands, usually so steady on the ice, began to shake. I picked up the device. It wasn't locked. Mark, the man who prided himself on architectural transparency, hadn't even bothered with a passcode. I scrolled. It wasn't just a fling, it was an archive. Photos of them at a park I thought was our spot, texts dating back 18 months, half of our relationship. While I was at the rink at 5 a.m., he was sending her "Good morning, beautiful" texts. While I was traveling for regionals, he was taking her to dinner. The sensual details in their messages, descriptions of her skin, the way she moved, things he used to say to me, felt like a physical assault. It was a choreographed betrayal, practiced and polished, while I was skating in circles, oblivious to the fact that my partner had changed the music long ago. The shower stopped. The sudden silence of the pipes felt like a deafening roar in the kitchen. I stood there, clutching the cold glass of his phone, my knuckles white. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribcage, thumping against the very bones that usually held me upright on the ice. I heard the bathroom door creak open, the familiar scent of his sandalwood body wash drifting toward me, a scent I used to associate with home, now turned into a trigger for nausea. "Hey, babe, you're home early," Mark said, his voice casual and warm as he stepped into the hallway, drying his hair with a gray towel. He looked so normal, so safe. The cognitive dissonance was a physical blow. How could a man who looked like my future be texting someone named Sienna that his bed felt empty without her? I didn't speak. I just held the phone up, the screen still glowing with her latest message. I watched his face, that face I had memorized in every light, transform. His easy smile faltered, then vanished. His eyes went from confusion to a sharp, cold realization. For a second, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. "Elle, I can explain," he started, the classic opening line of a failing script. He dropped the towel, and for the first time, I felt a wave of skin-crawling revulsion at the sight of his bare chest. I thought about her hands on that skin. I thought about the 18 months of work meetings that were actually rehearsals for this moment. "Explain 18 months, Mark?" My voice came out low, trembling with a jagged edge I didn't recognize. "Explain the urgent revisions while you were in her bed. Explain why I'm looking at photos of you two at the botanical gardens on our anniversary." He took a step toward me, reaching out, but I recoiled as if he were made of dry ice. I wasn't just a girl crying over a breakup. I was a skater who had just seen the entire rink shatter beneath her. The betrayal wasn't a slip-up. It was a deliberate long-term performance, and I was the only one who didn't know the show was a lie. Mark didn't collapse or beg. Instead, he did something worse. He practiced architectural logic. He leaned against the doorframe, rubbing his face with his hands, and let out a long, weary sigh. The kind of sigh you give when you're tired of carrying a heavy load, not the kind you give when you've just destroyed someone's soul. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Elle," he said, his voice dropping into that soothing register he used when I'd had a bad practice. "But you were never here. Not really. You were always at the rink or at physical therapy or asleep by 8 p.m. because of your training schedule. I was lonely. Sienna, she was just there. She didn't have a schedule. She didn't have goals that came before me." The audacity of it felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. He was blaming my career, the very thing he claimed to adore, for his choice to lie to me for 500 dates. It was the ultimate gaslight. He had watched me work myself to exhaustion, cheered for me from the stands, and then used that same dedication as an excuse to find warmth in someone else's bed. "So my dreams were the problem?" I asked, my voice cracking. I thought of all the times I'd skipped social events or pushed through injuries just to build a future for us. "You didn't have the guts to tell me you were lonely, so you just decided to have two of everything? Two girlfriends, two lives, two sets of I love yous?" He looked at the floor, his silence confirming everything. He wasn't even sorry for the betrayal. He was just sorry the logistical nightmare of maintaining two women had finally caught up to him. I looked at his hands, the hands that had held mine during my lowest moments, and all I could see was the skin he'd shared with her. Every "I love you" he'd whispered to me over the last year and a half felt like ash in my mouth. I wasn't just losing a boyfriend, I was realizing that the man I loved never actually existed. The room felt impossibly small. Every object in our apartment, the velvet sofa we chose together, the expensive espresso machine, the silk sheets on our bed, suddenly felt contaminated. Mark stood there looking at me with a mix of pity and frustration, and all I could think about were the sensory details I'd just scrolled through on his phone. He had described the way Sienna smelled, like vanilla and expensive tobacco. He'd complimented the softness of her curves, a pointed contrast to my athletic, muscular frame that was all lean power and hard angles. As a skater, my body is a tool, stiff, disciplined, often bruised. Reading his words to her, I realized he had begun to resent my strength. He wanted someone soft to sink into, while I was someone he had to support. "Did you bring her here?" I whispered, the question burning my throat. "In our bed, Mark, while I was at the 5 a.m. freestyle sessions?" while I was freezing my soul out on the ice to make you proud? He didn't answer immediately, which was an answer in itself. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the bedroom door. That slight flinch told me everything. I could almost feel her ghost in the room, the lingering scent of a perfume that wasn't mine, the heat of a body that hadn't spent a decade hardening itself against the cold. I felt a wave of visceral, skin-crawling nausea. I thought of the nights I'd come home late, exhausted and aching, and crawled into those same sheets, seeking his warmth. I'd press my chilled skin against his, thinking he was my heater, my safety. Now I wondered if he was still warm from her. The intimacy I thought was sacred was just a shared space, a revolving door of affection he navigated with the same cold precision he used for his blueprints. My skin felt like it was crawling off my bones. The nausea peaked and then, suddenly, it froze. It was a sensation I knew well, that moment right before a program begins, when the nerves vanish and are replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. My sadness didn't disappear, it just crystallized. I looked at Mark, really looked at him, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't see my partner. I saw a structural flaw, an unstable beam in a building I had tried to live in. "Get out," I said. My voice wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a blade slicing through fresh, hard ice. "Elle, don't be dramatic. It's my apartment too," he countered, his voice regaining that annoying, patronizing stability. "We need to talk this through. You're emotional right now. You're not thinking." "I am thinking with more precision than I've ever used in a Lutz, Mark." I stepped into his personal space. I was smaller than him, but I spent my life commanding air and metal. I channeled every ounce of that competitive steel. You used my career as a shield for your cowardice. You sat in the front row and clapped for me while you had her scent on your collar. You didn't just cheat, you stole my time. You stole my focus. You stole the years of my life where I was supposed to be at my peak. I walked to the closet and grabbed his expensive leather gym bag, the one I'd bought him for his birthday. I didn't pack it. I began shoveling his things into it with a frantic, rhythmic violence. His ironed shirts, his designer socks, the cologne that now made my stomach turn. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a hot fire burning under the ice of my skin. Every garment I threw felt like a weight lifting off my chest. I wasn't just clearing the room, I was purging the infection. "You're being hysterical, Elle. This isn't a performance. You can't just cut me out like a bad transition in your routine," Mark snapped, his voice finally losing its polished architectural calm. He reached for the bag, his fingers brushing my arm, and I flinched so hard I nearly tripped. That touch, the same one that had supposedly grounded me, now felt like a burn from dry ice. I didn't stop. I moved to the dresser, grabbing the watch I'd given him when he passed his licensing exam. It was engraved on the back, "To my foundation." The irony tasted like copper in my mouth. I threw it into the bag with a sickening clink against his belt buckles. "I'm not cutting you out, Mark. I'm clearing the ice," I said, my voice steadying into a terrifying low vibration. "You spent 18 months building a life with Sienna. Go live it. Go see if her softness can handle the fact that you're a liar who can't even look his girlfriend in the eye while he's destroying her." He stood there, framed by the doorway of the bedroom we had shared, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts of every "I love you" he'd whispered, while his thumb was hovering over a send button to her. I realized then that he wasn't just a cheater, he was a thief. He had stolen the mental peace I needed to compete. He had let me stand on the world stage, vulnerable and proud, while he was the only one in the audience who knew I was a joke. "Fine," he spat, grabbing the bag I'd stuffed. "If this is how you want to do it, fine. Call me when you're ready to be rational." He walked out, the heavy thud of the front door echoing through the apartment like a starter's pistol. I stood in the center of the living room, the adrenaline suddenly draining away, leaving me hollow. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a stadium after the lights go out, cold, empty, and haunted by a performance that was over. The apartment was suddenly too quiet. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a heavy fall on the ice, that disorienting second where you're not sure if you've broken something or if the world has just stopped turning. I walked into our bedroom, my legs feeling like lead, and sat on the edge of the mattress. The bed still smelled of him, sandalwood and that specific clean scent of his skin. I reached out and touched the pillow where his head had rested only hours ago. My skin crawled. I felt a visceral urge to strip the sheets, to bleach every surface, to scrub the very air until it didn't hold a single molecule of his presence. But I didn't have the strength. The adrenaline that had fueled my clearing the ice had evaporated, leaving me shivering. I curled into a ball on the rug instead of the bed. The floor was hard and unforgiving, much like the rink, and strangely, that felt more honest. For years, I had trained my body to be a temple of discipline, but my heart had been soft, a vulnerable spot I'd left wide open for him to guard. I felt a physical ache in my chest, a literal tightening of the muscles around my heart that made it hard to draw a full breath. I thought about these sensual messages I'd seen, how he'd described the way Sienna's hair felt against his chest. I looked at my own hands, calloused from tying laces, scarred from accidental blade nicks. I felt unfeminine. I felt like a machine that had been used for its utility and then discarded when a softer model came along. The betrayal wasn't just about him being with her, it was about the 18 months he spent comparing us in his head while I was kissing him goodnight. Every touch we'd shared during that time felt retroactively violated. I wasn't grieving a breakup, I was grieving a reality that had never actually existed. The next morning, I did what I always do. I went to the rink. I needed the cold. I needed the familiar weight of my skates and the rhythmic shuck of the blades carving through the ice. Usually, the rink is where the world becomes logical. Physics doesn't lie. If you lean correctly, you glide. If you jump with enough force, you fly. But as I stepped onto the white expanse, the silence of the empty arena felt oppressive instead of peaceful. I started with simple crossovers, trying to find my flow. My body went through the motions, but my mind was a chaotic playback of the night before. I tried to visualize my program, but all I could see was the glow of his phone in the dark kitchen. I tried to feel the air against my face, but all I could feel was the phantom sensation of his hands, hands that had touched her before coming home to me. I decided to go for a double axel. It's a jump I can do in my sleep. I built up the speed, felt the wind whip past my ears, and launched. But in mid-air, my axis, that invisible line of balance every skater lives by, was gone. My core felt hollow. I didn't rotate, I just tumbled. I hit the ice hard, not a graceful fall, but a sprawling, bone-jarring slam that sent a shockwave up my hip and into my spine. I stayed there for a long time, my cheek pressed against the freezing surface. The cold usually numbs the pain, but today it only made me feel more isolated. For the first time in my career, the ice felt like an enemy. It was honest, and it was telling me that I was broken. I wasn't just off balance. The very foundation I'd used to launch myself into the world had been dismantled by the man who promised to be my floor. I was still sitting on the bench, unlacing my skates with trembling fingers, when the rink's heavy side door groaned open. I expected my coach, ready to scold me for that sloppy fall, but the silhouette that stepped into the pale arena light didn't wear a tracksuit. She wore a long, camel-colored wool coat and carried a designer bag that looked far too expensive for a Tuesday morning at a public rink. Even from 30 feet away, I knew. It was the softness Mark had described, Sienna. She walked toward the bleachers with a hesitant, almost fragile grace. Seeing her in my sanctuary felt like a physical violation, like someone pouring ink into a clear pool. My survival instincts kicked in. I stood up, my socks sliding on the rubber matting, feeling suddenly exposed without the extra 2 inches of my blades. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice echoing off the high, corrugated ceiling. It sounded sharper than I intended, vibrating with a jagged, defensive energy. "You know," she whispered, stopping a few feet away. She didn't look like a villain. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with the same sleepless red as mine. "Mark called me. He's a mess, Elena. He told me you kicked him out. Is that why you're here? To play mediator for the man who spent 18 months treating me like a backup dancer?" I felt a hot, prickly heat rise up my neck. The contrast between us was agonizing. She smelled of that vanilla perfume, sweet and cloying, while I smelled of sweat, cold metal, and the sting of the ice. "I didn't know about you," she said, her voice trembling. "Not at first. He told me you were an ex-girlfriend who couldn't let go, a stockish athlete who lived at the rink. By the time I found out the truth, I was already in too deep." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, my training log. Mark must have left it in her car or her apartment or wherever they'd built their shadow kingdom. Seeing my private goals and failures in her hands was the final snap. The suddenness of the betrayal wasn't just in the discovery, it was in the realization that my entire identity had been a prop in their drama. I didn't take the notebook. I couldn't bring myself to touch anything that had crossed the threshold of her world. Seeing her standing there, the physical manifestation of every insecurity I'd suppressed for 18 months, felt like looking into a distorted mirror. Mark hadn't just cheated, he'd rewritten my character in his own twisted narrative. To her, I wasn't a dedicated athlete, I was a stalker ex. To me, he was a soulmate. To her, he was a man finally escaping a cold relationship. "You're telling me this to feel better about yourself?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "To make sure I know that even while he was kissing me, he was mocking me to you?" Sienna flinched. "No, I'm telling you because he's at my place right now, and he's talking about coming back to you. He says he made a structural error, like you're a building he can just retrofit after a fire." The terminology made my stomach turn. Structural error. Even in his guilt, he couldn't stop being an architect. He viewed our love as a blueprint that could be erased and redrawn. The sensual details he'd shared with her, the softness, the tobacco-scented nights, were just materials he'd used to build a temporary extension because the main house felt too chilly. "Let him stay," I said, the words surprising even me. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity, like the moment you find your edge after a wobbly landing. If he's at your place, let him stay there. He's your problem now. He's a house built on sand, Sienna. You think you're the special one because he chose you for 18 months? You're just the one who hasn't seen the foundation crack yet. I turned my back on her. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, to walk away while every nerve in my body wanted to scream, to demand to know exactly what he said about my body, my skating, our life. But as I walked toward the locker room, my footsteps echoed with a new, solitary strength. I was the one who knew how to balance on a blade. He was the one who couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet without a lie to prop him up. The locker room was empty, the air heavy with the smell of damp equipment and industrial cleaner. I sat on the wooden bench, staring at my reflection in the bented metal of the lockers. For the first time, I didn't see a competitor. I saw a girl who had been stripped of her skin. The emotional impact didn't hit me as a wave, it was a slow, freezing fog that settled into my marrow. I realized then that my loneliness wasn't just about Mark leaving, it was about the realization that I had been alone for 18 months while thinking I was part of a we. Every anniversary dinner, every late night's whispered secret, every time I'd turned to him for comfort after a bad skate, I had been performing to an empty seat. He wasn't there. He was with her, or thinking of her, or comparing the hardness of my muscles to the softness he craved. The sensual memories I'd cherished, the way he'd rub my sore calves after a long day, the heat of his breath against my neck, felt like physical violations now. Had he been thinking of Sienna's scent while he held me? Had he been practicing his lies in the shower before joining me in bed? The betrayal had retroactively poisoned my past. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to scrub my skin raw, to peel away every layer of me that he had ever touched. I didn't cry. Skaters don't cry until the music stops and the curtains close. But as I pulled on my coat, the weight of the silence was crushing. I had built my entire identity around being strong, around power and resilience. But as I walked out into the gray afternoon light, I felt like a glass ornament that had been dropped on concrete. I wasn't just losing a boyfriend, I was losing the version of myself that was capable of trusting the ground beneath her feet. The following week was a blur of autopilot. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, avoiding the spots where his shadow still seemed to linger. I finally stripped the bed, the scent of his sandalwood soap replaced by the sharp, sterile sting of extra-strength bleach. It felt like a surgical necessity. I wasn't just cleaning, I was decontaminating my life. The decision didn't come to me in a moment of zen. It came during a brutal 5 a.m. practice. I was working on my step sequence, the blades biting into the fresh ice with a crisp, rhythmic crunch. I caught my reflection in the plexiglass, pale, tired, but moving with a ferocity I hadn't felt in years. For months, I had been skating for us. I wanted his pride, his cocoa at the boards, his validation. But standing there in the center of the empty rink, I realized that the ice didn't care about Mark. The physics of my jump didn't change because he was in Sienna's bed. My strength was mine. It didn't belong to the man who used it as an excuse to be weak. Mark sent me a final email that night. It was filled with architectural metaphors about renovating our trust and reinforcing the cracks. He claimed he had left Sienna, that he was staying at a hotel, waiting for a sign. Reading his words, I felt a strange, cold detachment. He talked about my rigidity and how he hoped we could find a softer middle ground. That was the moment the resolution hardened. I didn't want a middle ground. I didn't want to be softer to accommodate a man who couldn't handle the steel in my soul. I realized that my athletic hardness, the muscles, the discipline, the scars, wasn't a flaw. It was my armor. I blocked his email address. I changed the locks. I didn't need a foundation that was actually a trap door. I was my own foundation. The apartment felt different after I changed the locks. The metallic click of the new key was a period at the end of a long, distorted sentence. But the physical space wasn't enough. I needed to reclaim the sensory map of my life. I went into the bathroom and looked at the expensive, floral-scented soaps Mark had bought for me. The ones he said made me smell more like a woman and less like the rink. I threw them into the trash. I stood in front of the mirror with a pair of professional hair shears. My hair had always been long, a requirement for the graceful, feminine aesthetic of my programs. Mark loved it. He used to wrap it around his hand while he slept. To him, it was a leash. To the judges, it was a costume. To me, it was just more weight to carry through a rotation. I didn't hesitate. I hacked through the ponytail in one clean, jagged motion. As the hair fell to the tiled floor, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with physics. I trimmed it into a sharp, defiant crop that framed my face like a helmet. I looked at myself, really looked, and saw the athlete again. I saw the girl who could withstand 4G of force on a landing. I saw the woman who didn't need a soft facade to be worthy of loyalty. That night, I went to a local dive bar, a place Mark hated because it was unrefined. I sat alone with a glass of whiskey that burned my throat in the best way possible. No cocoa, no cinnamon, no safety. Just the raw, stinging reality of being my own person. I watched the couples around me, wondering which of them were living in their own choreographed lies. And for the first time, I didn't feel pity or envy. I felt free. I had survived the crash, and while my body was bruised, the internal axis, the one Mark tried to shatter, was finally perfectly straight. It's been 6 months since the locks were changed and the hair hit the floor. I recently competed in my first major since the collapse. I didn't win gold, but I landed every jump with a visceral, grounding thud that echoed through the arena. Mark wasn't there with a thermos. Sienna wasn't there with her camel coat. It was just me, the ice, and a program I'd re-choreographed to a song that didn't ask for permission to be loud. Looking back, the betrayal wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was the 18 months I spent shrinking myself to fit into a foundation that was never meant to hold my weight. I learned that someone who calls your strength rigidity is usually just intimidated by a force they can't control. Mark didn't want a partner. He wanted a monument he could admire when it suited him and ignore when he needed a softer place to land. If I could offer any advice to someone standing on thinning ice, it's this: trust your internal axis. If the intimacy feels technical, if the phone stays face down, if you feel like you're performing a routine for an audience of one who isn't even watching, believe yourself. Don't write off your intuition as stress or paranoia. Your body knows when the surface is about to give way before your heart does. Betrayal is a bone-deep chill, but it's also a forge. It strips away the decorative fluff and leaves you with the steel. I used to think my value was in the perfect landing, in the grace and the smile. Now I know my value is in the fall. It's in the ability to hit the cold, hard reality at 40 miles an hour, feel the sting, and get back up before the music ends. I'm not softer now, I'm sharper. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the crack in the ice. I know exactly how to skate around it.